So let's go ahead and just look at the last section in Acts 11 then talks about the church in Antioch. And what's interesting about this is that we don't really know how the people there were converted. So this is probably another example of perhaps at Pentecost where believers went back. We do know a lot about Antioch, though. It was nicknamed Antioch the Beautiful. There's not a lot of it that's excavated now. If you go to it, it's in Turkey. It's right on the Syrian border in Turkey. You can go into a cave church where you can see how early believers, after this time period, how early believers worshipped. There's some interesting things there. But it was a major, major city. There's about 16 cities scattered throughout the Roman Empire called Antioch. And there's even one in Illinois, so what can I say? But it's named after the Antiochus line, so the Seleucids, the Antiochans. So that's kind of one of the reasons why you have so many. They're often given with Antiochus and then another name to designate where they are. This is the Antiochus that's on the Orontes River, so it's you can look at pictures of it. There's some pictures in the book. But Antioch the Beautiful had long paved boulevards with tree-lined streets. I mean, it was known for its beautiful place. From our story, it probably is one way to think about it is it's the birthplace of Gentile Christianity. I don't really like that designation, but what's going to happen is that the church is very clearly going to shift toward Antioch. And as the center of the church shifts away from Jerusalem and shifts towards Antioch, then sure, it is more focused on Gentiles just because of the composition of the area. What I don't want to suggest is two different kinds of Christianity, that there's kind of a Jewish Christianity and a Gentile Christianity. There's certainly a lot of people who want to argue for that. I don't think that's accurate. But what I also want to stress, too, is that's why I said that when we're talking about this early time period of the church, it's not helpful to think about things like Jews and Christians. It's much, much better to talk about followers of Jesus and then to talk about the background that a person comes from. So we have Jewish followers of Jesus, Gentile followers of Jesus. We could even go further. We could have Greek followers of Jesus, Roman followers of Jesus, people who come from the eastern part of the empire, followers of Jesus, because all of them are going to bring their own cultural background to the table when they're a follower of Jesus. The idea of talking about Jews and Christians is not helpful because we typically then start thinking, oh, Christians are followers of Jesus and Jews are not. And what I want us to see is at the very beginning, the context of the church is thoroughly Jewish. And so first followers of Jesus are Jewish. So if our category says if you're Jewish, you're not a follower of Jesus, that's going to cause some problems. So that's why I like to kind of make sure we're clear on that. It's also interesting that the designation Christian doesn't occur until here, Acts 11. And it was probably, or likely I should say, a derogatory term. People in Antioch were known for loving puns and word plays and stuff like that. So this Christianoi, these followers of Christ, it probably was not originally a positive term. There's some debate on that, to be honest, whether it was necessarily a derogatory term. But in all likelihood, it probably was. Now, it's interesting because we've come to embrace that term. And to be called a Christian is no shame. But originally, and it wouldn't have been to the early believers either. But I just want us to understand that that's not a term that believers themselves came up with. It was a term that came from the outside and was appropriated. Okay, what is also, I think, very interesting, again, is we don't know who evangelized this area, but we do know that the gospel is planted there. What I'd like to do also is just to kind of focus on chapter 12 quickly, and then I'm going to come back to Antioch and just as we look very quickly at chapter 12. But chapter 12 kind of interrupts the flow, so to speak, and it's an ironic passage. And so let me just make a few comments about it. So we start out in beginning of chapter 12, where we get Herod Agrippa, okay, so the grandson of Herod the Great, and it just says Herod, but if we're talking about King Herod at this time period, it has to be Agrippa. Obviously, we know that King Herod died, the first one died at Jesus' birth. So what's interesting here is we get a juxtaposition. And we get this picture in Acts 12 of King Herod arresting James and Peter and having James executed, which pleases the Jews. So now we're starting to also see a separation where there are going to be those Jews who oppose the gospel, and Herod is pretty smart, and he's got this idea that, wow, if James brought favor, Peter would bring even more favor. So he plans after the holiday to execute Peter as well. So Acts 12 opens up with Peter in prison and the martyrdom of James. Now, what's very interesting is that we get that wonderful account of Peter's miraculous deliverance from jail. Knocks on the door. Rhoda thinks that it's his ghost, and he has a hard time getting in to the house. But at the end of Acts 12, we see that Herod goes into the stadium, and apparently as he's entering into the access points into the stadium, he has on a silver robe, and it was early morning, and with the sunlight hitting it, it made it look like he was a god. Now, we don't know if the representatives from Tyre and Sidon were smart enough to figure out to acclaim him as a god, or whether they actually thought that he was a god. But we do know in this account, and then in a corresponding account from Josephus, that Herod received that worship, received that praise, and was struck dead. So it's such an amazing contrast, because at the beginning of Acts 12, we get this picture that the people of God are being persecuted and imprisoned and being martyred, and it looks like, okay, this is going to be an obstacle to the gospel. At the end of Acts 12, we have Peter free, the gospel advancing, and Herod is dead. So again, it's that little background comment or question that keeps running through Acts: who's really in control? Clearly, Herod is not in control. We've seen clearly the Caesars are not in control. So the kind of the undercurrent that runs through Acts is a couple of things: the unstoppable spread of the gospel, and that goes hand in hand with God is absolutely in control at every point. Okay. Let's go ahead, and I wanted to just skip over that little section, and as I said, we come back. And what I'd like to do is just make this comment about the composition of the church in Antioch. So let's look quickly at the beginning of Acts 13. In the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon, called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. Now, I just want to comment on that, because this is actually, again, very, very remarkable. And let's just unpack that a little bit of what this looks like. We have Barnabas. We already know that Barnabas is from Cyprus. He's Jewish. He's from Cyprus. So that already gives him a kind of an outsider's perspective. He's not from Jerusalem. He's not from Judea. So that already shows us a different background, a different perspective. Then we have Simeon from Niger or Niger. That would suggest that he's a black African. The next person is Lucius of Cyrene. That would suggest that he is an Arabic North African. An Arab North African. That would be kind of, just if you think about it, you have Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, and then you have North Africa. Then we have Manaen, who'd been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, probably Jewish, but somebody who is definitely familiar with Roman customs. If we know that the house of Herod was hand in hand with Rome, so here's somebody who grew up with privilege, wealth, and had a lot of access to the movers and shakers, so to speak. And then we have finally Saul. We haven't talked very much about Saul, but Saul was raised in Tarsus, an incredibly cosmopolitan city. Paul probably grew up speaking Aramaic, Greek, probably Latin. Okay, he grew up in an area that was well known for education, well known for cultural achievements, grew up as a Roman citizen, and yet a Pharisee of Pharisees, so thoroughly Jewish. And what I want us to just underscore, kind of think about, is that this is an incredibly diverse leadership. We often talk about kind of how you You know when a church has really embraced reconciliation and is really thinking about diversity when you see it in leadership. And here's what we see in their leadership. You could not have a more diverse leadership team. Now, the next thing I also think is equally remarkable. Verse 2, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work which I have called them." So after they fasted and prayed, they placed hands on them and sent them off. Now, I think what's remarkable about this is a couple of things. We've already seen that these 5 are the core leadership of the church at Antioch. And what I want us to realize is that 2 of the head pastors have been tapped on the shoulder to go overseas. We often don't think about it that way. Now, you may go to a church that really has a high view of missions, but it can be the case in some churches where missionaries are kind of the leftovers who are over there, but the really important people, the senior pastor. I mean, it's hard to think about in a lot of churches having a senior pastor be the one who said, okay, I've been called to go and take the gospel far from in a place that's far away from here. So what's remarkable about this leadership team is its diversity and the fact that the Holy Spirit says 2 of these are going to be sent out. Now, it's also interesting, we're not going to go into the first missionary journey in any depth, but what's interesting is just to note this. The Holy Spirit, they have hands laid on them and they're sent out, and where do they go? The 2 of them, sent on their way by the Holy Spirit, went down to Seleucia, that's the harbor, and sailed from there to Cyprus. Now, I love this. Why did they go to Cyprus? Well, Barnabas is from Cyprus. Now, what I want to underscore here is just another little comment, is that it's almost kind of like the Holy Spirit has set them out, and we can envision them walking down to Seleucia and saying, where should we go? I don't know, where should we go? Well, I'm from Cyprus, let's go to Cyprus. Okay, let's go to Cyprus. I mean, what I want us to see is that there's places in Acts where the Holy Spirit definitely directs individuals. I mean, preventing them from going north. They have to go in a certain direction. So there's supernatural ways that the Spirit leads, where he intervenes or leads Paul by a vision from a man in Macedonia. Come over here. But there's other times where we see the Spirit leading through circumstances. Why go to Cyprus? Well, Barnabas is from Cyprus. Let's just go there. We know the culture, we know the language, we know people, we can stay here, we can stay with my aunt, we can, all these kinds of things. And so I just want us to kind of see that we shouldn't always expect kind of this miraculous, supernatural way that the Spirit leads. Sometimes, a lot of times, the Spirit leads in our day-to-day circumstances. And that's just as much a work of the Spirit. Sometimes we're called to ministry situations because we work at Starbucks, because that's where we go every day. Sometimes God does speak a word and say, you know what? I want you to go to Paris. I want you to go to Nigeria. I want you, that happens as well. So we see both of that in Acts. And I think it's important to underscore that Acts is a wonderful balance of the Spirit providentially leading in everyday circumstances and the Spirit providentially leading in miraculous circumstances.